It's my pleasure now to invite Enrique Garcilazo. I hope I have pronounced your name, that I haven't butchered the name, Enrique. Enrique is Deputy Head of Division and Head of Regional and Rural Policy Unit with the OECD. Do you want to come up to the lectern? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It is clearly an Enrique show today, because before, when you were saying Enrique, I was getting a bit confused, thought it was myself. First of all, I'm giving this easy task on trying to provide some sort of conclusions to this very rich day. It's not easy to do. I think the quality of the discussions were very, very interesting, but I've been asked to try to bring some sort of summary. So the first thing is I would like to really thank the organizers. I would say the quality of the event has been superb. The food, the installation, it's really, really nice. It's one of at the top of my list. So I'd like to start with that part. The second part, I'd like to put things a bit more into perspective. Why is rural important? I think it's not just for rural development. Next week at the OECD, we're going to launch our regional outlook. This is our biggest publication in 2 years on regional development issues that's going to talk about inequalities. And what we've seen and what our analysis shows is that a lot of the inequalities are territorial and in specific between large places and rural. This morning we heard from the Commission how about 80% of the lagging regions are rural. And this is a big problem that we're trying to solve, how to address inequality. So I think rural development and what we're trying to do today is much broader than just making things better in rural places, but it's going to address dealing with these inequalities. And what we see is that if you don't address them, the whole system destabilizes and can really suffer. So I think it goes beyond what we're trying to discuss this part, and I think that's something important to keep in mind. The OECD is very happy with the developments of the European Commission, the long-term vision, the pact, the action plan. I think this is going into the right direction, so we're very happy, and that's why I'm also here trying to support this program and try to give it a bit more push on a couple of directions. But I think what I would like to focus some conclusions remarks today is to go beyond aspiration to delivery. I think a lot of the discussions is wishing how things are, but I think we really should focus on how to deliver policy. What are the sort of the takeaways? What are the things that we can try to get the Spanish presidency to put on the conclusions, to put on the legislation that can really make a difference? Throughout the event, I've heard two main things. One is we need less red tape, less bureaucracy from the Commission. We need more money across all the different stakeholders. I've been hearing it, lobbying for more money, but my conclusions are going to go into a slightly different direction. The first one is I think it's important to recognize that rural policies are no longer a narrow policy. It's a broad remit. I've heard about agriculture, agro-food, food processing, diversification of rural economies, services, fisheries, forestry, mountainous. It's a very diverse policy. But in the past, it was very narrowly defined. So we need to recognize this holistic vision into the legislation. It's not easy to do, but I think more can be done to show that rural policy is no longer how it was thought in the past. The second objective is, I think, the objective, we should focus on well-being. And this is a big change. We heard a lot about making things better in communities and people. In the past, rural policies were about commodities, agriculture, fisheries, mining, and so forth. So this is a big change if we put the focus now on people living in rural places. And of course, these items that we mentioned before are instruments that can go into delivering better standards of well-being. And when we deal with well-being, we must think about the three dimensions: the economic, the social, and the climate. So it goes back to the point of a holistic. The third point that I think resonated with me quite well is we have a lot of instruments, and we heard it this morning, they don't talk to each other. I don't think it's a matter of getting more money and resources, but how can we make this work in a bit better? So thinking about an integrated rural policy, how can we make all these different instruments, not just from the EU, but also from the national and the regional? I think there's more that can be done to come up with a more integrated rural policy. Now, I'm going to give some more concrete conclusions of that. The other thing that I think is very, very important, because we have a vision, but now we need to deliver on the vision, is to make rural policies a sort of a state policy. We heard this morning how in some countries there's shifts from right to left, even across levels of government, but we really need to make rural policies kind of like a sturdy one that is viewed as apolitical, that can continue to advance throughout the years, that doesn't fluctuate too much on one side to the next, that has clear long-term objectives, and that percolates down at the different levels. One of the other conclusions that I think we need to focus more on these bottom-up development approaches. We're all coming out from COVID, a lot of national programs. The Rural Pact is also something that comes from the Commission, but we need to really come up with this bottom-up led approach. And I would like to take a bit of reflection from the work that we're doing with indigenous communities. They make reference to prior and informed consent. And many times when we talk about bottom-up, in many countries, policies are discussed at the national scale. At some point, there's a consultation process, but that's too late. We need to work from the beginning, really get this endogenous approach from the outset, treat this local action groups and at the regional level as true partners in this endeavor, and not come when it's a bit too late. Come up with a true bottom-up led approach, and that will lead into some of the issues that we heard this morning about trust and acceptance of this policy. Unless you don't start with this bottom-up led approach, it's not going to succeed. A very, very important point on that is the geographic scale. We didn't talk too much about that. And designing policies at the right scale is very, very important, because one of the problems that rural policies have is they tend to be too fragmented, too isolated. Every small local community wants their own strategy. And one of the problems that rural economies face, you don't have critical mass, you don't have this sort of like cooperating scheme. So we need to think about geographies and what's the right scale to think about different delivery mechanisms. The notion of functionality is very important. In the past, it was applied to urban areas, but I think now we're working a lot about thinking about functional. What is the right functional scale for rural places when it comes to delivering services, when it comes about organizing an ecosystem? The next conclusions that I think is very important is to think of rural policies as breaking through this closeness. You know, rural communities tend to be like isolated and close and not willing to embrace change. I think it's very important that we think about how to deliver entrepreneurship and innovation, how to go away from a rural policy that it's about putting patches, coming up with temporary solutions, coming up with subsidies. So elements about inclusiveness, we heard this morning about gender and youth, are critical to make these places more open, embrace them, make them part of the societies. Thinking about urban and rural linkages is very important. So we also need to think about the design of rural policies with other areas. The other part is, of course, thinking about future ready and thinking about what are the opportunities in climate, what are the opportunities on new technologies. And this is a tremendous area that I think it's at the core of the center. We did a report on green jobs, and we found that only 9% of the green jobs are being produced in rural areas, where in fact rural regions produce about 63% of renewable energy. How can these policies be a bit more future oriented, thinking about placing rural places better against some of these megatrends? I think it's something quite important. The other is a very important area is we can no longer think about rural economies as just providing raw materials, food, energy to other areas. We need to come up with models that we also deliver in the places where some of these activities take place. Outside here, there's a big movement about the ESG, environment, social, and governance. coming up with business models that can really deliver jobs locally, I think is something that will build trust, that will overcome these problems of inequality that we're mentioning before, and these can be designed and built into the system. So coming up with ways of doing that, I think it's very, very important. The issue of building capacity is key. And it's not just building capacity, but building the right institutions and ways to reach a lot of the rural entrepreneurs and stakeholders. This morning we were thinking about how do we set up one-stop shops that combine different financing methods, how you can really reach out to the rural entrepreneur that's in the mountain. I think this element about building the capacities, but making institutions more reachable and accessible to some of these rural stakeholders is very, very important. We're thinking about delivering a policy. I think in relation to one of the points that I made earlier, we need to think about the enabling factors. We can no longer think about rural policies as a very narrow, but thinking about services. And we've done a lot of work on services. Services is spatially blind, but there's a lot of things that can be done to improve the delivery of services in some of these local places. Digital access, we talked about before, about how important this is. So setting the right conditions of these enabling factors and thinking about the geographic scale and how they talk to each other to make sure that we get some integrated solutions, I think it's one of the important elements. Rural proofing, we heard about it before, but I would like to go a bit more beyond rural proofing. I think rural proofing is necessary because we can rural proof all we want with different programs and say, well, this is rural proofed. We've got all the ingredients, but then we need to bake the cake. We need to make sure that this rural proofing is then integrated and it really responds to the different characteristics. I would say rural proofing, but also thinking about integrating the different elements in rural areas. Then two last points that I think are very important. One is on monitoring and data. Right now, there's a lot of discussion about coming up with granularity of data, but we talked in one of the sessions about global value chains, but we don't really know how they function. There's a lot of work that can be done with coming up with better data. Which rural areas are more advanced than others in terms of meeting climate change goals, in terms of being more inclusive or not? There's a lot of data that can really feed into the policy debate. And last but not least, I think it's very important to think about the cultural element. I think that was mentioned before. Thinking about branding and perspectives is not just a matter of policies and resources, but how do we come up with a different way of understanding and thinking? And in fact, a lot of these traditional sectors in rural are transforming. We're doing a lot of work on mining, and we see in countries like Australia, there's a lot of females that are employed in mining. A lot of the traditional sectors is no longer. So it's like changing this perspective. I think that's also required. And I think I went a bit beyond my time, but those are some of my reflections that I would like to bring back to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrique. Thank you.